A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
So, Herman, I was looking at some of the notes our housemate Daniel sent over this morning, and it really got me thinking about how much the landscape has shifted. We are well into March of 2026 now, and yet the conversation around crypto often feels stuck in 2017. People still talk about Bitcoin as if it is the only thing that matters, or they treat every other project like it is just a cheap imitation. It is like trying to discuss the modern internet, but only focusing on the original TCP/IP protocols, while ignoring everything from social media to cloud computing.
Herman Poppleberry here, and you are spot on, Corn. Daniel's prompt really hits on the core frustration of the modern user. We have moved past the era where it was just Bitcoin and a few clones like Litecoin or Namecoin. We are in a true multi-chain reality now. But that reality is messy. It is full of different architectures, competing philosophies, and, frankly, some pretty clunky plumbing that makes the whole experience feel like you are trying to use a dial-up modem to access a high-speed fiber network. We have these Ferraris of financial technology, but we are still driving them on dirt roads built for horse-drawn carriages.
It is a great analogy. I mean, if you look at the data, the sheer number of active non-zero balance addresses across the major layer 1 chains reached an all-time high just this past quarter. People are using these things more than ever, but the fragmentation is wild. Today, I want us to really tear apart this idea of the altcoin spectrum. Why do we have thousands of these things? Is it all just noise, or is there a fundamental architectural reason why one chain looks nothing like another? And more importantly, why is it still so hard to just buy a cup of coffee with it without jumping through 10 different hoops?
Well, the first thing we have to do is stop calling everything that is not Bitcoin an altcoin in a derogatory sense. While Bitcoin is the undisputed king of the store of value use case, the digital gold, if you will, projects like Ethereum have basically built a completely different category. I like to think of it as the difference between a high-security vault and a global operating system. Bitcoin is the vault. It does one thing, it secures value, and it does it with incredible, almost boring reliability. Ethereum, on the other hand, is a state machine. It is a world computer.
Right, and that distinction is not just marketing fluff. It goes down to the very way the ledger is constructed. Most people assume a blockchain is just a list of transactions, like a checkbook. But Bitcoin uses the unspent transaction output model, or UTXO, which is much more like physical cash. If you have a $5 bill and you buy something for $3, you do not just subtract 2 from a balance in a ledger. You hand over the $5 bill and receive $2 in change. The ledger tracks those specific pieces of money, those outputs. It is highly parallelizable and very private, but it is hard to build complex logic on top of it.
And that is why Bitcoin is so robust but also limited in its native logic. Ethereum flipped the script by using an account-based model, which is much closer to how a traditional bank works or how a database manages a user profile. You have an account, and it has a balance. When you send money, the network just updates the state of those two accounts. This sounds simpler, but it is actually what allows for the complexity of smart contracts. Because the network tracks the state of the entire system, the global state, you can write code that says, if this happens, then move this amount of money here and update this piece of data there. It turns the blockchain from a simple ledger into a programmable environment.
And that brings us to the Ethereum Virtual Machine, or the EVM. This is where the magic and the complexity happens. When you run a transaction on Ethereum, you are not just moving bits, you are paying the network to execute code. But here's the thing that I think trips up a lot of people, including Daniel in his prompt. Why does this make things so complicated for the end user? Why does it feel like you need a computer science degree just to move some funds from an exchange to a wallet and then into a decentralized finance protocol?
It is the trilemma, Corn. Scalability, security, and decentralization. You can usually pick two, but getting all three is the holy grail that everyone is still fighting over. Bitcoin shows security and decentralization, which is why it is slow and the blocks are small. Ethereum is trying to scale through a modular approach using layer 2s like Arbitrum or Optimism and technologies like sharding or data availability layers. But every time you add a layer to solve a problem, you create a new piece of plumbing that the user has to navigate. You have bridges, you have different gas tokens for each layer, you have different wallet configurations. It is like having to change your currency and your passport every time you cross a street in the same city.
It really is. And we see this divergence even more clearly when we look at the long tail of obscure coins. Most of those are just forks or minor tweaks of existing code, often with very little actual innovation. They are the Me Too projects of the crypto world. But then you have the serious contenders, the ones trying to solve the trilemma in fundamentally different ways. You have Solana with its proof of history, trying to maximize throughput by essentially time-stamping transactions before they even hit a block. You have Polkadot trying to create a network of networks where different chains can talk to each other natively. But every time one of these protocols tries to be the one chain to rule them all, they often end up just adding another silo to the ecosystem.
And that brings us to the plumbing problem Daniel mentioned. The gateways. This is the part that drives me crazy. We have these incredibly sophisticated, decentralized protocols, but the moment you want to turn your US dollars or your Israeli shekels into crypto, you are forced back into the legacy banking system. You are dealing with centralized exchanges, KYC, or know your customer regulations, and anti-money laundering checks that can take days. It is the ultimate irony. To get into a permissionless system, you have to ask permission from a centralized gatekeeper who is still using technology from the 1970s.
It is a massive point of failure. We talked about the plumbing of the global shadow economy back in episode 983, and it is fascinating how the crypto world is essentially trying to rebuild that plumbing in the light. But the friction is immense. Think about the process for a new user in 2026. Even with all our progress, you still usually have to link a bank account, wait for a wire transfer to clear, which can still take 24 hours because banks don't work on weekends. Buy a stablecoin like USDC or Tether, then move that coin to a self-custody wallet, and then interact with a decentralized exchange. Each one of those steps is a potential point of failure, where you could lose your funds, get phished, or get stuck in a regulatory loop.
And let's talk about those stablecoins for a second, because they are the grease in the gears of the entire crypto economy. Without USDC or Tether, the whole thing would grind to a halt. They provide the bridge between the volatile world of crypto and the relatively stable world of fiat. But maintaining that peg is a technical and regulatory tightrope. In episode 471, we looked at digital wallets and how difficult it is to even export your own transaction history for tax purposes. In crypto, you have the opposite problem. The history is public and permanent, but the interface to manage it is often a nightmare. You have to use block explorers that look like they were designed for Linux sysadmins in the 90s.
That is a great point. The transparency of the blockchain is a double-edged sword. On one hand, you can verify everything. You can see exactly where the money went. On the other hand, if you make one mistake in a long string of alphanumeric characters, your money has gone into the void. There is no customer service number to call for a blockchain. This is why the gateway friction is so high. The centralized exchanges are effectively acting as the insurance layer for a system that was designed to not need insurance. They are the safety net that reintroduces the very centralization we were trying to avoid.
And that is where the conservative worldview really comes into play here, Korn. We believe in individual responsibility and sovereignty. Crypto, in its purest form, is the ultimate tool for that. It allows you to be your own bank. But being your own bank is a heavy burden. Most people are not ready for that level of responsibility. They want the convenience of the legacy system with the returns of the crypto world. That tension is exactly why we have this messy middle ground of regulated gateways and centralized bridges. We are trying to have our cake and eat it too, and the result is a lot of crumbs in the keyboard.
It also makes the system vulnerable to political pressure. We have seen how governments use the banking system as a weapon. If you control the fiat gateways, you effectively control the flow of capital into the decentralized world. For a country like the United States, Maintaining the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency means having a very tight grip on these on-ramps. And for us here in Israel, where we are constantly navigating complex geopolitical and financial realities, having a decentralized alternative is a matter of national and personal security. But that alternative is only as good as our ability to actually use it without being blocked at the gate by a bank that doesn't like the risk profile of digital assets.
And when you look at the technical side of these bridges, the protocols that allow you to move assets from Ethereum to, say, Avalanche or a layer 2 like Arbitrum, they are often the most targeted parts of the ecosystem by hackers. Because they hold massive amounts of locked collateral, they are like giant digital honeypots. If the bridge fails, the wrapped assets on the other side become worthless. We saw this with some of the major hacks over the last few years. It is a fundamental architectural weakness in a fragmented multi-chain world. We are building these amazing islands of innovation, but the bridges between them are made of rope and wood.
So, why not just stay on one chain? Why do we need the long tail? Is there any real utility in having 1,000 different tokens, or is it all just a giant casino?
I think 99% of them are garbage, honestly. They are speculative vehicles with no underlying purpose. But the diversity itself is a feature, not a bug. It is an evolutionary process. We are testing different consensus mechanisms, like proof of stake versus proof of work, different privacy features, and different governance models. Some chains are optimized for gaming, where you need high speed and low cost but maybe less decentralization. Some are for high frequency trading, some are for long-term storage. The problem isn't the number of chains, it's the lack of seamless interoperability. We are still in the era where every website has its own proprietary browser. We need a common language that allows these ledgers to talk to each other without needing a centralized middleman to translate.
It feels like we are waiting for the TCP/IP moment for blockchains. Right now, we have all these local area networks that are great if you stay inside them, but the moment you want to send a packet to another network, it gets complicated. And that brings us back to what Daniel was asking about the ledgers themselves. If you are a developer, the choice of ledger architecture, UTXO versus account-based, is a fundamental decision that dictates what you can actually build. You can't just port an Ethereum app over to a UTXO chain like Cardano or Bitcoin without completely rethinking the logic. It is like trying to run a Windows app on a Mac in 1995.
Right, and that is why you see such a divide in the developer communities. The Ethereum crowd is all about the global state and composability. They want to be able to plug different protocols into each other like Lego bricks. You can take a loan from one protocol, swap it on another, and provide liquidity on a third, all in a single transaction. That is, money Lego. The Bitcoin crowd, and to some extent the UTXO-based altcoins, are much more focused on predictability and local state. They argue that the account-based model is inherently less scalable because every node has to keep track of the entire world's balance at all times. In a UTXO model, you only need to know about the specific outputs you are trying to spend. It is a more Unix-like philosophy. Do one thing and do it well.
It's a classic engineering trade-off. Do you want a system that is easy to program for but hard to scale globally, or a system that is hard to program for but naturally scales through parallelism? Currently, the market seems to be siding with ease of programming. The EVM has become the industry standard. Even chains that aren't Ethereum are making themselves EVM compatible, just so they can tap into that developer pool. It is like how every operating system eventually had to support C or Java. But that standardization also creates a monoculture risk. If there is a vulnerability in the EVM architecture, it ripples through the entire ecosystem.
That is why I think the long tail of weird coins is actually important. We need projects that are trying completely different things, like zero-knowledge proofs for privacy or directed acyclic graphs for consensus. Even if most of them fail, the 1% that survives will provide the next breakthrough. But for the average person, this variety just looks like chaos. They see Pepe Coin next to Ethereum on a list, and they don't understand that one is a global computing platform and the other is a meme. The plumbing doesn't distinguish between them, which is part of the problem.
Let's pivot to the practical side of this, because I know a lot of our listeners are trying to navigate this right now. If you are looking at a project and trying to decide if it is a serious utility platform or just speculative noise, what are the red flags? For me, the biggest one is when a project claims to have solved the trilemma without explaining the trade-offs. If they say they are faster, cheaper, and more decentralized than Ethereum, they are probably lying about at least one of those things. Usually, they are sacrificing decentralization.
There is no free lunch in distributed systems. If a chain is incredibly fast, it usually means it has a very small number of validators, which makes it centralized and vulnerable to censorship or hardware failure. If it is incredibly cheap, it might be because it is subsidizing transaction fees with its own token inflation, which isn't sustainable long term. You have to look at the economic model. Is there a real reason for this token to exist? Does it provide utility within the network, like paying for gas or governance, or is it just a way for the founders to exit? If the utility is just that you can sell it to someone else later, that is a red flag.
And then there is the gateway issue. For the average person, the best advice is still to use the most reputable on-ramps, even if they are centralized. But once you have your assets, you have to get them off the exchange. We have seen what happens when people leave their money on centralized platforms. Celsius, FTX, the list goes on. If you don't hold the keys, you don't own the coins. This is the part of the plumbing where the user has the most control, but also the most risk. It is the burden of sovereignty we talked about earlier.
Self-custody is the only way to truly bypass the gateway friction once you are in the system. But it requires a level of operational security that most people find daunting. You need a hardware wallet, you need to manage your seed phrases, and you need to understand how to interact with different protocols safely. We covered some of the extreme measures for critical redundancy in episode 771, and while most people don't need a Faraday cage for their crypto, the mindset of expecting the worst is very healthy in this space. You have to assume that every link you click is a drainer, and every bridge is a honeypot.
I also think we need to address the misconception that crypto is just for illegal activity or bypassing regulations. While the shadow economy certainly uses these tools, as we discussed in episode 983, the vast majority of the plumbing we are talking about is being built to comply with existing laws. The friction comes from the fact that we are trying to force a 21st century technology into a 20th century regulatory framework. The banks are still using COBOL and batch processing while we are trying to settle transactions in seconds. It is a total mismatch of speeds.
It is like trying to merge a Formula One car onto a dirt road full of horse-drawn carriages. The horse-drawn carriages are the traditional banking rails. They are slow, they only work during business hours, and they have a million checkpoints. The Formula One car is the blockchain. When the two meet at the gateway, there is inevitably a massive pileup. The regulators are trying to put speed limiters on the Formula One car to make it safe for the horses, but that just ruins the car.
So where do we go from here? Do you think the plumbing will eventually get hidden? Like, will Daniel be able to use these protocols without ever knowing he is interacting with a blockchain?
That is the goal. We call it abstracting away the chain. Ideally, your wallet should just show you your balance and your options, and it should handle all the bridging, gas fees, and swap logic in the background. We are seeing some progress there with account abstraction on Ethereum, EIP 4337, and the rise of AI-driven intent engines. In episode 841, we talked about AI gateways and how they are becoming the Engine X of the model era. I think we will see something similar in crypto intelligent gateways that route your transactions through the most efficient path without you having to understand the underlying ledger architecture. You just express an intent, and the plumbing handles the execution.
That would be a game changer. Imagine just saying to your phone, I want to earn 5% yield on my savings, and an AI agent handles the fiat to stablecoin conversion, finds the best decentralized finance protocol, manages the cross-chain bridge, and sets up the smart contract, all while ensuring you stay compliant with your local tax laws. That is the dream. But we are a long way from that being safe and reliable for the average person. Right now, the AI is just as likely to send your money to a scammer as it is to a yield farm.
We are still in the dial-up phase for sure. You have to know the commands, you have to hear the screeching of the modem, and you have to pray the connection doesn't drop mid-download. But the infrastructure is being laid. The fact that we are even having this conversation about EVM versus UTXO and gateway friction shows how far we have come from the early days when it was just a few cypherpunks sending Bitcoin back and forth. We are arguing about the plumbing because the building is finally being constructed.
I want to go back to the distinction between store value and utility for a moment. Do you think Bitcoin will ever adopt these utility features, or is it better off staying as a simple, robust ledger? We have seen things like ordinals and layer 2s on Bitcoin recently.
There is a big debate about this. Some people want to turn Bitcoin into a platform for smart contracts and NFTs, but I tend to agree with the purists on this one. Bitcoin's greatest strength is its simplicity. Every line of code you add is a new potential bug or attack vector. If you want a world computer, use Ethereum or Solana. If you want a rock-solid, immutable ledger for your life savings, use Bitcoin. Trying to make one do the other's job usually results in a compromise that satisfies no one. It's the do one thing and do it well philosophy. But that means the plumbing between the store of value and the utility becomes even more critical.
If I have my wealth in Bitcoin, but I want to use it in a decentralized application on another chain, the bridge between them has to be incredibly secure. Currently, most of those bridges are either centralized, like wrapped Bitcoin, or highly experimental. This is where the gateway problem extends beyond just fiat. It is also about crypto-to-crypto gateways. If someone can build a truly decentralized, trustless bridge between Bitcoin and the rest of the ecosystem, that would unlock trillions of dollars in value. It would be like connecting the world's largest gold reserve to the world's most advanced stock exchange.
And that is a huge opportunity for innovation. But we also have to talk about the regulatory side. We have seen a lot of movement in the US and Europe regarding stablecoin legislation and exchange licensing. As conservatives, we often push back against overregulation, but in this case, does a clear legal framework actually help the plumbing?
It is a double-edged sword. On one hand, clear rules give institutional investors the confidence to enter the market, which brings in more liquidity and better infrastructure. On the other hand, if the rules are too restrictive, like requiring a license for every single node operator, it kills the decentralization that makes the technology valuable in the first place. The ideal is a light-touch framework that focuses on the gateways, the centralized on-ramps and off-ramps, while leaving the decentralized protocols themselves alone. But politicians love to control things, so I am not holding my breath.
And from an American perspective, there is a real risk of driving this innovation offshore. If the US makes it too hard to build crypto plumbing, the next generation of financial infrastructure will be built in Dubai, Singapore, or even here in Tel Aviv. We have already seen some major firms move their operations out of New York because of the regulatory environment. That is a massive loss of talent and capital. It's a national security issue, honestly. If the future of finance is digital and decentralized, the country that leads in building that infrastructure will have a massive advantage. You don't want to be the country that banned the internet because you were worried about what it would do to the postal service.
So, for Daniel and our other listeners, what are the key takeaways from today?
First, understand that not all crypto is the same. There is a fundamental architectural difference between a store of value chain like Bitcoin and a utility platform like Ethereum. Know what you are using and why. Don't buy a Ferrari to haul gravel, and don't use a vault to run a website. Second, be aware of the plumbing. The gateways and bridges are the most vulnerable and friction-heavy parts of the system. Minimize your use of bridges where possible, and always be cautious with centralized exchanges.
I would add that simplicity is often a sign of security. If a project is incredibly complex and has a million moving parts, there are a million things that can go wrong. Bitcoin is simple for a reason. And finally, don't ignore the importance of self-custody. It is the only way to truly realize the promise of this technology, even if it comes with a steep learning curve. If you're interested in the more technical side of this, I highly recommend checking out episode 590, where we dove into the reality of smart contracts in the current year.
And if you want to understand the broader context of how money moves around the world, episode 983 on the shadow economy is a must. Listen, it really puts the plumbing of crypto into perspective. It shows that the problems we are trying to solve aren't new. We are just trying to solve them with better tools.
This has been a fascinating dive, Herman. I think we have barely scratched the surface of some of these architectural debates, but hopefully this gives our listeners and Daniel a better framework for thinking about the ecosystem. It is not just a bunch of random coins. It is a complex, evolving web of ledgers and gateways that are trying to rebuild finance from the ground up. It is messy, it is frustrating, but it is also the most exciting thing happening in technology right now.
And it is happening right in front of us. We are moving from the era of what is crypto to the era of how do we make crypto work for everyone. The plumbing might be messy right now, but that is where the most interesting work is being done. The people who fix the plumbing are the ones who will build the future.
Well said. And hey, if you've been enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us out. We have been doing this for over 1,000 episodes now, and it is the support from our regular listeners that keeps us going. We really appreciate you sticking with us through all the technical deep dives and weird prompts.
Yeah, it genuinely makes a difference. We love seeing the show reach new people who are as nerdy about this stuff as we are. It makes the long nights of research worth it.
You can find all our past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today, at myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there, and an RSS feed if you want to subscribe directly.
And if you have a topic you want us to dive into, there is a contact form on the website. We are always looking for new, weird prompts to explore. No topic is too obscure or too technical for us.
Thanks for listening to my weird prompts. I am Corn Poppleberry.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. We will see you next time.
Until then, keep digging deeper and don't be afraid to look under the floorboards at the plumbing. It might be messy, but that is where the truth is.
Spoken like a true Poppleberry. Goodbye, everyone.
Take care.
So, Corn, before we wrap up completely, did you see that new research on zero-knowledge rollups for the UTXO model? It might actually bridge that gap we were talking about earlier. It could bring Ethereum-style smart contracts to a Bitcoin-style ledger without sacrificing the parallelism.
I did. It is fascinating. It basically allows for private, complex transactions without needing a full-state machine. It uses the UTXO model for the ledger, but uses ZK proofs to verify the logic off-chain. We should probably do a whole episode on that soon. It might be the missing link for Bitcoin utility.
Definitely. There is always something new. That is the beauty of this space. Just when you think you understand the architecture, someone comes along and flips the script.
And the curse. My reading list is already 3 miles long. I feel like I'm running a race where the finish line keeps moving 10 miles further away every time I take a step.
Only 3 miles? You are falling behind, brother. I have a stack of white papers on my desk that is literally threatening to collapse and crush me.
Fair enough. All right, let's get some lunch. I think Daniel is cooking something that actually smells decent for once. Maybe he finally figured out the plumbing in the kitchen.
Now that would be a real breakthrough. If he can master a stove, maybe there is hope for the global financial system after all. See ya.
See ya. Thanks for listening, everyone. This has been episode 1009 of My Weird Prompts. We are available on Spotify and at our website, myweirdprompts.com. See you in the next one.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth